At the heart of America is a dirty and shameful reality. Everyone knows it exists, but the devastating impact it has left on generations of people has been glossed over and even ignored, especially by those who still benefit from it. Our American history is rooted in racism. More obvious chapters include the decimation of Native American populations, slavery, segregation, and the Jim Crow era. Most Americans have learned about, or at least heard of these events. But ask them about the eugenics movement, or when homegrown extremists filled Madison Square Garden for a Nazi rally, or how Henry Ford's hatred of Jews helped inspire Adolf Hitler, and you're likely to get a blank stare. It's time to explore these overlooked events that don't make it into our history books, and correct the record for the people harmed by them, to trace our past to modern tragedies, and learn how folks over the centuries have fought back. We need to confront our racist history so that we might have a chance to defeat it once and for all. I'm Christian Picciolini, a former white supremacist who became an anti-racist activist and a bringer of hard truths. On each episode of F Your Racist History, you'll learn about America's conveniently overlooked racist origin stories. Join me as we yank off the hood and expose the lies behind some of America's so-called triumphs and heroes. This is episode 1 of F Your Racist History, Henry Ford and his pal Hitler. Fall 2018, Dearborn, Michigan, USA. The Dearborn Historical Museum's quarterly publication, The Dearborn Historian, is about to drop its fall issue. The cover story, written by editor Bill McGraw, is an expose on one of Dearborn's most famous figures, Henry Ford. In it, McGraw illuminates a dark piece of the automobile titan's history, the time when Ford bought a local news journal called the Dearborn Independent, and through a series of editorials called the International Jew, exposed himself as one of America's most famous and outspoken anti-Semites. McGraw titles the story Special Report, Henry Ford and the International Jew. But before he can ship the magazine to subscribers, Dearborn, Michigan Mayor John B. O'Reilly steps in and halts distribution, confiscates all printed copies, and presumably has them destroyed. Then, he fires Bill McGraw as editor of the Dearborn Historian in January 2019. Let me say that again. In America, in 2019, an editor of a historical publication was fired for writing a factual article about American industrialist Henry Ford. What was so wrong with this story that the mayor of Dearborn fired McGraw and had the edition permanently pulled? It was a desperate move, which called more attention to the small publication than it probably would have received otherwise, even had the article come out. What did Mayor O'Reilly really want to keep hidden? To understand, we have to go back to the 19-teens, back when nearly everyone in the United States considered Henry Ford its greatest national hero.
Mr. Henry Ford.
A typical short bio of Henry Ford might sound something like this. By the time the First World War was underway, Henry Ford was in his 50s and the king of the automakers. An industrialist who began with relatively nothing and rose to become a business magnate. A man we've built statues to honor and museums to educate. Without a doubt, a traditional American success story. Dare we say, the American dream? Born during the Civil War, Henry Ford was the first child in his family to survive infancy. His parents were rural farmers with a homestead in Dearborn, Michigan. After his parents gave him a watch for his 13th birthday, Ford took it apart to see how it worked and was able to reassemble it with relative ease. This was a defining moment for him. He discovered his love for mechanics. Ford didn't learn his trade from books. He learned it through hard work and tinkering. He got his hands into the industry at an early age. At 17, he trudged 13 miles, on foot presumably, from Dearborn into Detroit to work an apprenticeship as a machinist on the dry docks. In 1888, At 25, he married a Christian farm girl named Clara Bryant. They had one son, Edsel. Throughout the 1890s, Ford worked as an engineer for Thomas Edison, who turned into a lifelong friend, for George Westinghouse as a steam engine mechanic, and he studied bookkeeping. He was truly a self-made man, an American icon of the times, and an all-around Midwestern success story. A pull-yourself-up-by-the-bootstraps kind of guy. In essence, the lifeblood of a quickly expanding Americana, and a living, breathing example of the results of hard work and ingenuity. Ford followed his natural talent for mechanics and built a gasoline-powered engine in the 1890s. By the turn of the 20th century, he'd made several innovative automobile prototypes that sold modestly through a business he formed called the Henry Ford Company. When he realized his true ambition was to build an affordable vehicle for the common man, rather than the luxury vehicles he was making exclusively for the wealthy, he left his namesake company, which eventually became Cadillac, and formed Ford Motor Company. In 1908, Ford came out with the Model T, a more powerful and less expensive automobile than the higher-end vehicles on the market, and effectively revolutionized the industry.
During the year 1903, 88 new makes of automobiles were introduced in the United States. But this one was different. This was Henry Ford's car, and it was destined to become a symbol of mobility for decades to come.
Before long, Ford Motor Company was at capacity for orders, and Ford had to figure out a faster, cheaper way to manufacture his Model Ts. His solution was the assembly line, which again revolutionized American industry.
Right from the beginning, Fords changed our lives. They bore our loads, brought us transcontinental friends. And Mr. Ford's assembly line started it all.
By the mid-19-teens, the Model T was the most popular car in the country. A decade later, Ford Motor Company would build over 15 million of them. By 1915, however, Ford also began to set his sights on other endeavors. In August of that year, he publicly declared himself a pacifist activist. The Daily Notes quoted him on August 23rd. "I will do everything in my power to prevent murderous, wasteful war in America and in the whole world." Then in December, Ford chartered a peace ship to Norway called the Oscar II in an effort to help end World War I. Was he naive? Absolutely. This perception of his oblivious idealism deepened when the Chicago Tribune lashed out at him for his pacifist stance on American intervention in Mexico in 1916. He eventually abandoned the venture after constant bickering aboard the peace ship killed his morale. When it docked in Norway, Ford returned home, and the war continued. By the summer of 1916, tensions between Mexico and the United States had reached a boiling point, leading to the Mexican Border War. Mexico was in the throes of its revolution. Bands of fighters led by Pancho Villa were venturing across the Mexican-American border, attacking American towns and pillaging for supplies. So President Woodrow Wilson deployed troops to launch an offensive attack. The American press largely supported the war with Mexico, a prospect that deeply offended pacifist Henry Ford. A Chicago Tribune reporter at the time interviewed a Ford employee who said that if anyone who worked for Ford Motor Company joined the National Guard and went to the Mexican border to fight, Ford wouldn't hold their positions for them, nor pay their salaries while they were away. In other words, Ford wouldn't support American servicemen in action, a stance which the Tribune denounced in a front-page editorial with the headline, "Henry Ford is an anarchist." They dubbed Ford an ignorant idealist, an out-of-touch millionaire who had no appreciation for the people fighting for his right to make vast wealth. Ford had a fragile ego, and he couldn't abide being labeled an anarchist, so he sued the Chicago Tribune for $1 million in damages for libel. The case went to court 3 years later, in March of 1919. The trial was a circus. When Ford took the stand, his testimony embarrassed him deeply. The Tribune's lawyers quizzed him on American history, the result of which can be summed up with the following example republished in the law publication Litigation in the fall of 2005. Tribune's lawyer: "Have there ever been any revolutions in this country?" Ford: "There was, I understand." Tribune's lawyer: "When?" Ford: "In 1812. After repeated verbal traps, where Ford misplaced the American Revolution in 1812 and misidentified Benedict Arnold as a famous writer, Tribune lawyers also asked Ford to read something on the stand, which he repeatedly refused, leading to the suspicion that Ford was nearly illiterate. The trial ended with a verdict in favor of Ford, essentially clearing his name in the libel suit, but the jury's award of just 6 cents infuriated him. Feeling like the press repeatedly misrepresented his opinions and unfairly attacked him, Ford bought a small local journal called the Dearborn Independent in a revenge move. And this is where the typical biography of Henry Ford begins to splinter into a racist nightmare. When Ford bought the Dearborn Independent, it was a floundering publication. It needed reviving. So he assembled his very own crack team of editors and writers. As the publication's manager, Ford assigned Ernest Liebold, a trusted aide of his since 1911. Historians maintain that Liebold was a notorious anti-Semite. Together, they hired several employees from the nearby Detroit News. As editor, they hired Edwin Pipp, a liberal Catholic man, apparently known for muckraking, a term for the use of defamatory information to intentionally injure a person's reputation. This technique was, and still is, a favorite among politicians. As head writer, Ford and Liebold hired William Cameron, a Canadian writer and columnist they believed had a credible reputation. Ford's new paper's motto: Chronicler of the Neglected Truth. Anyway, the team published the first issue of the Dearborn Independent bearing Ford's name in January 1919. An initial reception was disappointing. It apparently lacked the sensationalism of other publications of the day. The Detroit Times called it, quote, "the best periodical ever turned out by a tractor plant." For the first 16 months, the Dearborn Independent maintained itself as a progressive and pacifist publication. But that all changed in May of 1920. During a staff meeting, Dearborn Independent writer Joseph O'Neill recommended they, quote, "find an evil to attack, go after it and stay after it, name names and tell actual facts. Let's have some sensationalism," end quote. It turns out Ford and Liebold both agreed on just the, quote, evil to attack: Jews. Ford had blamed Jews for the start of World War I. He resented big banks, which he believed were Jewish tools of oppression over hardworking Americans, a common, though unfounded, anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Liebold, his trusted advisor, was overjoyed at Ford's new anti-Jewish angle, and the paper quickly went to work on drafting a campaign to bring to light what they viewed as a global threat. William Cameron wielded the pen. The first issue, titled The International Jew, The World's Problem, went to press on May 22, 1920. It was the first of 91 issues published in this vein. Ford even allegedly hired agents, aka goons, to lurk around Jewish neighborhoods and gather incriminating evidence supporting his made-up conspiracies. Not everyone at the Independent was on board, however. Editor Edwin Pipp quit before the issues went to press, refusing to be associated with an anti-Semitic rag. He established his own periodical called Pipp's Weekly and often published editorials criticizing Ford and the Dearborn Independent. This did nothing to halt Ford's anti-Semitic campaign. Per Ford's Independent in June of 1920, quote, "There is no other racial or national type which puts forth this kind of person. It is not merely that there are a few Jews among the international financial controllers. It is that these world controllers are exclusively Jews." End quote. Ford's newspaper falsely blamed Jews for everything from spawning the Russian Revolution in 1917, working with the treacherous Benedict Arnold during the American Revolution, to fixing the 1919 World Series. According to Ford, even jazz music was the result of negative Jewish influence over the white Western world. Not on the list back then? Space lasers. You can see how far this garbage travels. This international anti-Jewish conspiracy theory was not birthed by Ford or his lackeys, however. It stemmed primarily from a notorious Russian anti-Semitic forgery from 1903 called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that Ford's Dearborn Independent published on their pages as factual information. It was, in fact, fake news. The racist text which Ford published expounded a false conspiracy that a small group of powerful Jewish men was responsible for every disaster, financial, natural, or otherwise, in the world. Jews were supposedly the puppet masters of the universe, controlling news and holding ultimate power. Historians believe it's likely that if Ford hadn't published an English translation of the protocols in his newspaper, this horrid trope might have died a long time ago. Instead, he happily published the lie as news and breathed new life into it, helping spread it far and wide. Ford funneled millions of dollars into his newspaper's distribution, putting it in front of as many eyeballs as he could. Because he was so famous and respected, Ford's anti-Semitic views began to spread and take hold with average Americans. He also forced Ford motor dealerships to buy his newspapers and sell subscriptions. If you bought a Model T between 1920 to 1922, chances were that you would drive your new Ford automobile off the lot and find a hate-filled issue of the Dearborn Independent on the dashboard or in the glove box. Ford also had the paper mailed to schools and libraries all over the United States. The Ku Klux Klan enjoyed reprinting Ford's articles as well. At its most popular, the Dearborn Independent reached weekly circulation numbers close to 900,000. Ford and his associate Ernest Liebel then established the Dearborn Publishing Company and put the articles together into a 4-part book series titled The International Jew, released between 1920 and 1922. The volumes are subtitled The World's Foremost Problem, 1920, Jewish Activities in the United States, 1921, Jewish Influence on American Life, 1921, and Aspects of Jewish Power in the United States, 1922. They also deliberately avoided copyrighting the books, so other anti-Semites could be free to reproduce the work without infringement or permission in the future. Despite its growing popularity, there was also a significant backlash against Ford's paper. Per Dearborn historian journalist Bill McGraw, who had his expose of Ford pulled, as the Independent launched its anti-Semitic campaign and sent the paper unsolicited to libraries and schools across the nation, protests broke out. Some cities attempted to ban the paper, but such moves raised First Amendment issues. Jews organized Ford motor boycotts. Former President William Howard Taft, a future U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice, and the only person to ever hold both positions, slammed Ford in a speech. Later, he joined outgoing President Woodrow Wilson in signing a petition that denounced the Independent. Wilson was another notorious bigot who called blacks, quote, an ignorant and inferior race. But that's for another episode. Nevertheless, Ford carried on with his racist attack on Jews. What is mildly surprising about Ford's actions, however, is that he had Jewish friends. I'm putting up air quotes around friends. One example is Rabbi Leo Franklin, a former neighbor of Ford's. Ford sent Rabbi Franklin a new Model T every year. In 1920, the rabbi stopped accepting the gift, and Ford was allegedly baffled by his rebuff. After all, the Dearborn Independent had consistently maintained that, quote, good Jews had nothing to worry about. The Independent's anti-Jewish attacks also spawned numerous lawsuits. The first was in 1921 by a playwright named Morris Guest, who sued for $5 million after Ford's paper had implied that Guest, who is Jewish, wrote, quote, lewd plays. The second was Herman Bernstein, a journalist who also happens to be Jewish, who had traveled with Ford aboard the Oscar II peace ship back in 1915. Ford alleged that Bernstein had confirmed to him details behind the global Jewish conspiracy. Bernstein wasn't having it. Nevertheless, neither of those lawsuits came to fruition. But suddenly, in 1922, the Independent paused its anti-Jewish hate campaign. No one knows for sure why this happened, but high-profile figures at the time were likely gearing up to take on Ford and the Independent. Fearing bad publicity, Ford toned down his anti-Semitism, but this interlude was only temporary. By 1924, Henry Ford's 4-volume book series, The International Jew, had sold over 200,000 copies, been translated into 13 languages, and was being distributed on 3 continents. The book even got the attention of the most infamous anti-Semite in history, Adolf Hitler. At that point, Hitler was 35 years old and only just embarking on his political career. He was still 9 years away from becoming Chancellor of Germany and leader of the murderous Third Reich.
Tonight, it seems clearly apparent that the first great phase of the war in the West has been won by Germany. The army of French and British has made a valiant battle in its effort to retreat to Dunkirk, where there is some slight chance that some part of it can be evacuated.
Adolf Hitler's mechanized forces are racing toward Paris as French resistance collapses.
The young, aspiring politician Hitler even gave his enthusiastic support of Ford in 1923 upon learning that Ford might run for president of the United States when he said, and I quote, "I wish I could send some of my shock troops to Chicago and other big American cities to help in the elections. We look to Heinrich Ford as the leader of the growing fascist movement in America. We have just had his anti-Jewish articles translated and published. The book is being circulated in the millions throughout Germany." Hitler was rumored to keep copies of Ford's book on a table in the office of the National Socialist German Workers' Party building in Munich. He even kept a photo of the automaker behind his desk. To Adolf Hitler, a famous American industrialist like Henry Ford holding the same anti-Semitic views confirmed this international Jewish conspiracy. Hitler deeply respected Ford. He used Ford's assembly line idea in Germany to produce the Volkswagen, Germany's version of the Model T. Henry Ford is also the only American mentioned in Hitler's 1925 memoir, Mein Kampf. Before the end of that same year, Ford and the Dearborn Independent were back at it again, this time attacking a Jewish lawyer named Aaron Sapiro, who was organizing farm cooperatives across the United States. Maintaining nostalgic views of independent farming of the late 19th century, Ford disapproved of cooperatives, seeing them as another ploy by Jewish socialists to increase the cost of farm products. Per Ford's Independent, a band of Jew bankers, lawyers, moneylenders, and agencies, fruit packers, professional office managers, and bookkeeping experts is on the back of the American farmer. The paper attacked Sapiro for being a cheat and a liar. So, Sapiro sued for libel, seeking $1 million in damages. But unlike the libel suits brought against Ford before, this one would go to trial. Shapiro made a point of suing Ford himself rather than the Independent, thereby placing responsibility for the newspaper's anti-Semitic claims squarely on Ford and his personal views. In response, Ford's lawyers had William Cameron, head writer for the Dearborn Independent and author, ghostwriter of the International Jew, testify that he was solely responsible for the content of the newspaper, claiming Ford did not know of the articles before publication, nor did he ever read the paper. Shapiro's lawyers countered by calling James M. Miller, an employee of the Dearborn Publishing Company, to testify that he and Ford had a conversation during which Ford said he wanted to expose Shapiro as a cheat. Despite Ford's best efforts to avoid another embarrassing cross-examination like the one back in 1918 during the Chicago Tribune libel suit, he was subpoenaed to testify. But the night before his scheduled appearance, Ford reported he was in a serious, get this, car accident. He was taken to, get this again, Henry Ford Hospital and kept out of public view. Doctor's orders. Things get even more suspicious after that. Shapiro's lawyers asked the judge to send an impartial doctor to examine Ford. Ford's lawyers responded with an onslaught of affidavits alleging juror misconduct and juror tampering by Shapiro's team. They claimed a juror named Cora Hoffman had accepted a bribe in the form of a mysterious package. Hoffman responded by denying these claims to a reporter, which resulted in the judge declaring a mistrial. Ford's lawyers swiftly brokered a settlement with Shapiro, which included the cost of legal fees, the establishment of a scholarship fund for an unnamed underprivileged child, a full printed retraction of the International Jew in the Dearborn Independent, the issuance of a public apology, and the halting of all distribution of Ford's anti-Semitic book series. Ford then worked with Lewis Marshall, president of the American Jewish Committee, to prepare a public apology that would be published in the Dearborn Independent and beyond. The following are snippets of an apology published as Ford's own words that bore his signature. For some time past, I have given consideration to the series of articles concerning Jews which since 1920 have appeared in the Dearborn Independent. Some of them have been reprinted in pamphlet form under the title The International Jew. Although both publications are my property, it goes without saying that in the multitude of my activities, it has been impossible for me to devote personal attention to their management or to keep informed as to their contents. It has therefore inevitably followed that the conduct and policies of these publications had to be delegated to men whom I placed in charge of them and upon whom I relied implicitly. This has led me to direct my personal attention to this subject, in order to ascertain the exact nature of these articles. As a result of this survey, I confess that I am deeply mortified that this journal, which is intended to be constructive and non-destructive, has been the medium for resurrecting exploded fictions, for giving currency to the so-called protocols of the wise men of Zion, which have been demonstrated, as I learn, to be gross forgeries, and for contending that the Jews have been engaged in a conspiracy to control the capital and the industries of the world, besides laying at their door many offenses against decency, public order, and good morals. It is needless to add that the pamphlets which have been distributed throughout the country and in foreign lands will be withdrawn from circulation, that in every way possible I will make it known that they have my unqualified disapproval, and that henceforth the Dearborn Independent will be conducted under such auspices that articles reflecting upon the Jews will never again appear in its columns. Henry Ford, Dearborn, Michigan, June 30, 1927. In other words, Henry Ford claimed he had no idea what was being published in his newspaper for 7 years. If you believe that, I have an Edsel to sell you. For obvious reasons, people at the time also doubted the sincerity and truthfulness of Ford's apology. As we already know, he was almost illiterate, so he certainly didn't write it himself. People, rightfully so, were also angry with Lewis Marshall for letting Ford off the hook so easily, and no one actually believed Ford didn't know what his underlings were doing. Ford's later actions would all but prove his apology was just an attempt to save face and get out of a messy legal battle. In 1938, just before the start of World War II, for his 75th birthday, Henry Ford, the great American pacifist who did nothing to scream from the rooftops about the atrocities to come, accepted the Grand Cross of the Supreme Order of the German Eagle as a gift from Adolf Hitler himself. In response to outrage over his receipt of this award, Ford later said, "Acceptance of a medal from the German people does not, as some people seem to think, involve any sympathy on my part with Nazism. Those who have known me for many years realize that anything that breeds hate is repulsive to me."
On April 9, 1940, the leaders of Nazi Germany shifted their war machine into high gear. They overran into Denmark. They smashed into Norway. On May the 10th, 1940, they blitzed into Holland and Belgium.
Ford did shut down Dearborn Independent for good by the end of 1927, but he did very little to halt the distribution of the International Jew in Europe. It was widely circulated throughout Germany in the 1930s and had a significant impact on young Nazis and the Hitler Youth. Nazi war criminal Baldur von Schirach also testified during the Nuremberg trials after World War II that the International Jew inspired him to hate and kill Jews. Historian Leo Rebuffo wrote in his 1980 piece on the International Jew, Ford informed the Manchester Guardian in 1940 that, quote, international Jewish bankers, end quote, had caused World War II. At roughly the same time, Ford told American nativist Gerald L.K. Smith that he had allowed an associate to forge his signature on his public apology, that he hoped someday to reissue the International Jew, and Ford urged Smith to do so if he could not live long enough to do it himself. These are not the actions of an apologetic or remorseful man. According to historian Carol Gelderman, when Ford saw footage of the liberation of the Majdanek concentration camp in 1945, he was horrified. Perhaps then, he finally realized his anti-Semitic tropes might have been connected to or helped cause those atrocities. Too little, too late. Henry Ford died 2 years later. In the decades after his death, Ford Motor Company tried to repair the damage their founder had caused. Ford's grandson, Henry Ford II, took over the company in the early 1940s and began supporting Jewish charities and businesses after World War II ended. The Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith awarded Ford Motor Company their American Heritage Award in 1980, signaling to the world the relationship between Ford's company and the Jewish people had improved. In 1997, Ford Motor Company funded a nationally televised commercial-free broadcast of Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List. And finally, in 2019, Ford opened a research center in Tel Aviv, Israel to develop self-driving cars, a move that would ensure collaboration between Ford and the Jewish people for many years to come. Happy ending, right? Let's go back to 2018. When Dearborn Mayor John B. O'Reilly pulled the fall issue of the Dearborn Historian because of journalist Bill McGraw's expose cover story on Henry Ford's anti-Semitism. Mayor O'Reilly was quoted as saying that the article was a distraction that lacked a compelling reason directly linked to the events in Dearborn today. But that's not true. Henry Ford's legacy and his writings in The International Jew continue to live on today in white supremacist circles and among neo-Nazis. McGraw provided two pertinent examples of Ford's influence online in his 2018 article. Quote, on Stormfront, a toxic white nationalist online forum, a contributor has taken the screen name Dr. Ford and uses a photo of Henry Ford as a profile image. On the same forum, a participant whose screen name is Allison RM wrote in 2020, quote, "I'm currently reading The International Jew, Essays from the Dearborn Independent by Ford. Read these great books. We, the white race, need to encourage ourselves and our children." Former President Donald Trump even praised Ford for his, quote, "good bloodlines" during a visit to a Ford motor plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan in 2020.
Thank you very much. I like that dais very much, actually. It's very special. The company founded by a man named Henry Ford, good bloodlines, good bloodlines. If you believe in that stuff, you got good blood.
And because of Henry Ford's decision not to copyright The International Jew, anyone can now reprint and distribute it. Sadly, you can currently buy digital copies on Amazon, and several variations are available for purchase in print at walmart.com. The reviews as of today have been wiped clean. But again, Bill McGraw plucked a choice review from Amazon back in 2018. Quote, "The International Jew is a wonderful book that should be required reading for all Americans," wrote Tara in a 5-star Amazon review. Quote, "Sadly, many people like to label Henry Ford as an anti-Semite when nothing could be further from the truth." End quote.
It is a fact that, in one way or another, few lives have remained untouched by Mr. Ford's vision. Our working, our building, our concept of distance, the contours of our cities, all have been shaped by the world of Ford.
What is true is that even when people or companies take steps to make amends for past wrongs, lasting damage often remains and festers for generations. While it's imperative to continue to hold those who've harmed society accountable and to atone for our own past mistakes, it's also critical that we work to prevent racist policies and practices from taking hold in the first place. That's all for today. Join me next time as we shine a light on another shameful chapter of our country's racist past. We can't beat the problem if we can't see it. You've been listening to F Your Racist History. If you like what you've heard, do us a favor and rate us on whichever platform you listen on. It helps. You can get more information on this and other episodes at fyourracisthistory.com or on your favorite podcast app. F Your Racist History is produced by Goldmill Group and distributed by Sounder. This episode was researched, fact-checked, and written by Maggie Coomer and Jasmine Brand. Links to source material and references are included in the show notes. Our editor is Ken Pendola. Music is courtesy of Flatfoot 56. Jamie Moeller is our producer. And I'm the executive producer and your host, Christian Picciolini. Thank you for joining. See you next time. And as always, F Your Racist History.